Welcome to the Graduated Thoughts Podcast.
I want you to take a second and just imagine something for me.
Right.
Imagine waking up tomorrow and learning that almost everything you thought you know about the origins of human civilization, the roots of global innovation, and basically the whole timeline of world history was just a tiny fraction of the actual story.
Like a footnote.
Exactly. What if the history you were taught in school didn't just miss a few details, but completely skipped over 200,000 years of foundational human achievement?
It really is a dizzying thought, isn't it? To realize that the timeline we all just sort of accept as absolute.
Right. Starting with Greece or Rome?
Yeah, that timeline moving westward. To realize that might just be the final chapter of a much, much longer, far more complex human story.
And that is the exact paradigm shift we are exploring today. Welcome to our deep dive. Our mission for this session is an extensive, incredibly detailed exploration of the role of Black people in ancient and world history.
We are pulling from a lot of material today.
We really are. We aren't just looking at one perspective. We are unpacking an absolutely massive stack of groundbreaking and, in many cases, highly provocative sources.
Definitely.
We're talking about texts like When the World Was Black, Dr. Vaughn's The Truth About Black People and Their Place in World History, John Henrik Clarke's Christopher Columbus and the African Holocaust.
And Claude Anderson's Black Labor, White Wealth.
Yes. Plus, Chancellor Williams's foundational text, The Destruction of Black Civilization, Joseph Ben-Jochanan's Cultural Genocide, and Ivan Van Sertima's They Came Before Columbus.
It is a truly formidable collection of scholarship.
Right. And our objective with this deep dive is to map exactly how these texts challenge the Eurocentric historical narratives we're all so used to.
We're going to trace Black contributions from deep antiquity through the classical ages, across the oceans, and all the way up to the foundations of modern capitalism.
And crucially, we are also going to explore the specific mechanisms of historical erasure, the actual architecture of how this history was obscured from the world.
How it was hidden.
Exactly. Now, before we really get into the weeds of this timeline, I need to make something very clear to you, the listener.
Yeah, this is important.
The texts we are examining today contain highly charged political, racial, and religious critiques regarding European, Arab, and Asian historical imperialism.
Very strong critiques.
So as your guides on this deep dive, it is vital to state that we are not taking any political sides.
We never do.
Right. We are impartially reporting the viewpoints, the arguments, and the historical interpretations contained strictly within the source materials provided to us.
Our role isn't to endorse these viewpoints or preach to you.
Not at all. We are simply here to convey the raw ideas, the data, and the context of these texts so you can fully understand the profound arguments being made by these authors.
Precisely. We are here to synthesize the data. We are mapping the territory of their historical analysis so you can navigate it yourself.
So let's start at the very beginning of that map, and I mean the absolute beginning.
The very deep past.
Yeah. When we look at When the World Was Black, the author makes a point that completely upends the traditional historical timeline. The core argument is that Black history does not begin with the transatlantic slave trade.
Not even close.
It spans over 200,000 years across every square inch of the planet.
The sheer scale of the timeline being presented in these sources is what forces a complete recalibration of how we view human progress.
It's massive.
It is. The texts detail early technological milestones that really stretch the modern imagination.
Right, like what?
Well, for instance, they point to East Africans pioneering technological industries 2 million years ago.
2 million.
Yes. And they detail South Africans mastering early forms of chemistry and technology roughly 60,000 years ago.
And Central Africans.
Right. Central Africans pioneering complex ecology and conservation 30,000 years ago.
Okay, let's pause on that because I want to make sure I'm wrapping my head around the terminology here.
Sure.
When this source says technological industries 2 million years ago, we obviously aren't talking about factories and smokestacks. What exactly constitutes an industry in that era?
That's a great clarifying question. In paleoanthropology and in the context of these sources, an industry refers to the systematic, continuous, and standardized creation of tools.
Okay.
We are talking about the Oldowan and later the Acheulean stone tool industries. The authors highlight that these weren't just random rocks picked up to smash a nut.
Like it wasn't an accident.
Exactly. This was the deliberate sourcing of specific materials, the understanding of fracture mechanics to create sharp edges, and the teaching of this standardized manufacturing process across generations.
So it's the passing down of knowledge.
Yes, that is the definition of industry right there. standardized production, and the transmission of technical knowledge.
And the cognitive leap required to do that is just massive. But what really caught my eye in these sources is the claim about chemistry in South Africa 60,000 years ago.
The Blombos Cave discoveries.
Yeah, what evidence are the authors pointing to for that? Because chemistry implies a very deliberate manipulation of matter.
It does, and the sources are pointing to specific archaeological sites showing early humans systematically processing ochre.
That's like a red clay, right?
Right. But they weren't just crushing it to make red dust to smear on themselves. The authors highlight that they were creating complex compounds.
Like actual recipes.
Yes. They were grinding the ochre, mixing it with heated crushed bone to act as a binder, adding charcoal, and using specific liquid bases to create pigments that could be stored in abalone shells.
Wow.
Furthermore, they were creating highly effective adhesives.
Adhesives, like glue.
Exactly. By mixing plant gums with ochre and systematically heating them to precise temperatures to attach stone points to wooden shafts.
That is wow.
That requires an understanding of thermal transformation and chemical binding. That is chemistry.
That is fascinating. So 60,000 years ago, you have populations operating what are essentially early laboratories, understanding the properties of the material world.
Long before anyone else.
And then the sources mention Central Africans pioneering ecology 30,000 years ago. How is that defined?
The authors argue that as these populations expanded, they didn't just wander aimlessly. They developed a profound understanding of the carrying capacity of their environments.
So they knew what the land could handle.
Exactly. They tracked animal migration patterns, they understood the life cycles of specific plant species, and there is evidence of early mathematical tracking of lunar cycles.
Ishango bone, right?
Yes, the famous Ishango bone, which would be vital for predicting seasons, rains, and animal movements. They were actively managing their ecosystems.
Which is basically the foundational precursor to agriculture.
That's exactly what it is.
You know, when you lay out the specific evidence, the standardized tool manufacturing, the ochre compounds, the mathematical tracking of seasons, it completely dismantles this popular, pervasive historical trope.
The primitive caveman trope.
Right, the savage just stumbling around in the dark.
That is exactly the author's broader point. The texts argue that these early humans possessed highly advanced, sustainable systems of living for millennia.
They weren't primitive at all.
No. The concept of savagery is presented in these texts not as a historical reality, but as a much later culturally biased construct.
The label.
Yes, a label retroactively applied by later colonizing powers to justify their dominance.
Because it's easier to dominate a savage?
Precisely. The populations described in these sources weren't primitive beings waiting in the dark to be civilized. They were the world's first true innovators.
Writing the original blueprints.
The blueprints for human survival, cognition, and advancement that the rest of the globe would eventually inherit.
It makes me think of an analogy. Imagine you are reading a 1,000-page, incredibly detailed book on the history of human progress.
Okay, 1,000 pages.
But your history curriculum told you to skip the first 997 pages and start reading on page 998.
You'd miss everything.
You would genuinely think the entire story of civilization happened in those last few pages. You would think the Greeks and Romans were the opening act.
That's a really apt analogy.
But according to these sources, the popular image of classical history is just the tail end of an immense, dizzying timeline of African prehistory.
Because when you start on page 998, you completely miss the context of everything that came before.
You view everything as magic.
Right, you view subsequent achievements as spontaneous miracles rather than the result of millennia of trial, error, and compounding knowledge.
It didn't just happen overnight.
And that raises a crucial conceptual bridge for our exploration.
Which is?
If these populations possess this profound, deeply rooted understanding of chemistry, ecology, and organization, how did that knowledge manifest when they eventually settled into highly structured societies?
How did they scale it up?
Exactly. How did the ecological pioneers evolve into the builders of the world's most famous ancient empires?
Which takes us right to the banks of the Nile and the heart of the continent. We're looking heavily at the works of Dr. Vaughan, Chancellor Williams, and Dr. Benjo Cannon here.
The leap in scale is just breathtaking.
It really is. Let's look at the preservation of knowledge. The texts state that Black Egyptians essentially revolutionized human memory by creating paper around 4000 BC.
The invention of papyrus. It is impossible to overstate how revolutionary this was.
Because before that, you're looking at clay tablets or stone.
Right. The shift from carving information laboriously into stone or pressing it into heavy clay tablets to writing on a lightweight, portable, and easily stored medium, it's one of the most critical leaps in human cognitive and administrative history.
It allowed them to actually build an archive.
It allowed for the rapid transmission and immense accumulation of data.
And the scale of that accumulation is what blows my mind. The sources estimate that there were over 700,000 books in the libraries of Egypt long before the Greek poet Homer was even born.
700,000.
700,000. We are talking about a civilization that had built a literal mountain of written knowledge covering medicine, astronomy, mathematics, philosophy, during a period when much of Europe was still largely in its pre-literate infancy.
It's staggering.
The sources frequently point to texts like the Book of the Coming Forth by Day and Night, which is often called the Papyrus of Ani, as a cornerstone of this output. What exactly is contained in a text like that to make it so significant?
Well, the Papyrus of Ani is a profound theological and philosophical document.
People usually just call it the Book of the Dead, right?
Yes, and it's often mischaracterized simply as a Book of the Dead, like it's just consisting only of magic spells.
But it's more than that.
Much more. As the authors we were reviewing point out, it is actually a comprehensive moral and spiritual framework.
Oh, interesting.
It details the concept of truth, balance, order, and cosmic justice. It contains the negative confessions.
What are the negative confessions?
It's a highly evolved moral code where the deceased must swear they have not committed various ethical transgressions.
Like saying, I haven't stolen, I haven't murdered.
Exactly. Codes that significantly predate and actually mirror the biblical Ten Commandments.
Wow. So they had a fully formed legal and moral philosophy.
A society that produces a text like this and reproduces it widely is a society deeply engaged in complex philosophical thought about the nature of the soul and human ethics.
You know, when I think about an archive of 700,000 books, it indicates something very specific about their day-to-day lives.
That they had time.
Right. It means this was a society that had achieved such a level of agricultural and administrative stability that they had the profound leisure time and the massive intellectual infrastructure required to just observe, record, and catalog the universe.
Exactly. You cannot support a class of full-time scholars, scribes, and priests if you are struggling to feed your population.
We're just trying to survive at that point.
Right. And the texts emphasize that this level of sophisticated urban organization wasn't just limited to the libraries.
Where else do we see it?
They point to Thebes, or No, as it was originally known as the Mother of Cities.
The Mother of Cities. I love that title.
Thebes was the chief center of religion and administration in Africa, built with complex urban planning long before the dawn of Roman history. It was a metropolis of spirituality intertwined with immense political power.
And a crucial point the sources make is that this wasn't just an isolated pocket of greatness clustered strictly around the Nile while the rest of the continent sat idle.
No, not at all.
This is where Chancellor Williams' work, The Destruction of Black Civilization, introduces some truly paradigm-shifting data.
His field work is legendary.
Williams conducted a 16-year field study across the African continent. Can you break down how he actually did this? Because a study of that magnitude sounds incredibly daunting.
It is a monumental piece of scholarship. Chancellor Williams didn't just sit in a library reading European accounts of Africa.
He went out there.
Over 16 years, he conducted extensive field research covering 105 different language groups across the continent.
That is dedication.
He relied heavily on comparative linguistics and deep oral histories, cross-referencing the oral traditions of vastly separated groups to find historical commonalities.
So he's looking for the thread that connects them all.
Yes, he was looking for the underlying cultural and political bedrock that existed before the major disruptions of colonialism and the slave trade.
And his conclusion from cross-referencing all those 105 language groups is staggering. He argues that he found evidence of a continent-wide constitutional system and fundamental human rights.
A shared political origin.
Right, but what does a continent-wide constitutional system actually look like in antiquity?
Williams argues for a massive, underlying, unified black power structure, or democratic ethos in antiquity. Despite the vast geography, he found a shared legal framework.
Can you give an example?
Sure. He noted recurring constitutional principles. For instance, the idea that the land belongs to the community, not the individual ruler.
So the king couldn't just sell the country.
Exactly. And the concept of a council of elders that acts as a definitive check and balance on the power of the king.
Meaning the king was rarely an absolute autocrat.
Right. and deeply ingrained fundamental rights of the individual within the community. He argues this commonality proves a shared, highly evolved political origin.
So you have this deeply rooted democratic framework. You have the philosophical output of 700,000 books. But how did that translate into tangible, hard engineering?
They were master builders.
The sources detail massive industrial undertakings alongside the philosophy. They talk about the smelting of iron, a thriving copper industry, and the construction of massive durable boats.
The engineering is really where the theoretical meets the practical. Take iron smelting, for example.
Okay.
The authors point to evidence in places like ancient Tanzania, where African engineers were designing furnaces with forced draft systems.
What does a forced draft system do?
It allowed them to achieve temperatures that European furnaces couldn't consistently achieve until the Industrial Revolution.
That is centuries later.
Exactly. And the boat building is crucial because, as the texts point out, these weren't just river rafts. They were deep-water vessels.
Which implies an understanding of hydrodynamics and navigation.
Absolutely.
But why did they push the sciences so hard? The authors suggest it wasn't just for economic gain, but that their engineering was deeply tied to their philosophy.
That is a vital point of analysis. In these ancient African societies, religion, mathematics, and science were not separate disciplines.
They were all connected.
They were born out of the same necessity. Consider the African belief in immortality, the idea that the soul persists after death and requires a physical anchor.
Okay, so a mummy or a tomb.
Yes, but think bigger. That specific theological belief directly necessitated the development of architectural sciences.
Oh, I see where you're going.
If you believe a pharaoh is going to live forever as a deity, you must build an eternal monument.
The pyramids.
Therefore, the pyramids are not merely tombs. They are the physical manifestation of a spiritual belief, requiring absolute mastery of geometry, quarrying logistics, and astronomy to align the shafts with specific star systems.
The science was driven by the spiritual imperative.
Exactly.
Imagine what it must have felt like to walk through those societies. To be a citizen of Thebes or early Egypt, seamlessly blending esoteric spirituality with the most cutting-edge engineering on the planet.
Must have been awe-inspiring.
To know your society is operating at the absolute pinnacle of human capability. It must have bred a culture of supreme confidence.
A true golden age. But as the stack of sources points out, this immense accumulation of power, science, and knowledge wasn't contained by the oceans or the deserts.
It started to spread.
It eventually spilled outward, and its influence on Europe was profound, particularly during a time when the European continent was going through a period of severe regression.
Which brings us to a fascinating shift in our timeline. We are moving forward from deep antiquity into the European Dark Ages, roughly the 7th to the 14th century AD.
The Middle Ages.
Right, and the sources draw a stark, almost jarring contrast between the continents during this period.
The contrast is indeed stark. The authors emphasize that following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, Europe descended into a severe period of intellectual, societal, and economic stagnation.
They lost a lot of ground.
Urban centers depopulated, long-distance trade withered, and the vast majority of the classical knowledge of the Greeks and Romans was lost or locked away in isolated monasteries.
And into that vast European void steps General Tarik and his Black Moorish army from North Africa.
A huge turning point.
The sources detail how they crossed into the Iberian Peninsula and conquered Spain in 711 AD. And there is a piece of geographic trivia in these texts that blew my mind.
The Rock of Gibraltar.
Yes. The famous Rock of Gibraltar is actually a linguistic corruption. It's originally named after General Tarik himself.
Yes. Jabal Tariq, meaning the Mountain of Tarik.
That's amazing.
The linguistic footprint of their arrival is literally carved into the geography of Europe.
Now, what exactly did the Moors bring with them? Because the texts state that at this time, the European population was up to 90% illiterate.
Very low literacy rates.
The authors argue it was the Moors, heavily influenced and supported by thriving, incredibly wealthy West African empires like Ghana, Mali, and later Songhai, who essentially re-civilized the Iberian Peninsula and, by extension, Europe.
The texts provide very specific examples of this re-civilization process. While cities like London and Paris were essentially muddy towns with largely illiterate populations and little to no sanitation.
The stereotypical Dark Ages, Bert.
Exactly. But the Moorish city of Cordova in Spain became the jewel of Europe. The sources detail how the Moors introduced paved, well-lit streets centuries before the rest of Europe.
Paved and lit streets.
They built hundreds of public baths, elevating public hygiene. They introduced advanced agricultural techniques, including complex irrigation systems and water wheels,
So they completely transformed the infrastructure.
and brought new crops like citrus fruits, cotton, and sugarcane to the region.
And the intellectual contribution was even more massive.
Absolutely. The Moors established dozens of universities and massive libraries in Spain. They had preserved, translated, and expanded upon the ancient Greek texts, works of Aristotle, Euclid, and Ptolemy that Europe had lost.
They brought the knowledge back.
They brought advanced algebra, the concept of zero from the east, and sophisticated astronomy. European scholars from the north would travel to Moorish Spain just to study in their universities.
It was the intellectual hub.
The translation of these texts from Arabic into Latin in places like Toledo was the direct intellectual spark that eventually ignited the European Renaissance.
And the sources don't just focus on the Moors. They highlight other Black historical figures with massive global footprints who are often either glossed over or mischaracterized in mainstream history.
Like Hannibal.
Yes, a prime example is Hannibal Barca from Carthage.
Hannibal is arguably one of the greatest military tacticians in human history.
The stories about him are legendary.
The texts emphasize his logistical genius in leading a diverse army of nearly 100,000 soldiers, complete with war elephants, from North Africa, through Spain, and over the freezing Alps to strike at the heart of the Roman Republic.
Over the Alps with elephants.
The occupied parts of Italy for 15 years. The authors point to him as an example of undeniable African strategic and military brilliance that challenged the greatest European power of the ancient world.
And the global reach didn't stop at the borders of Europe. I want to bring in a fascinating component from Ivan van Sertima's They Came Before Columbus, which really expands this narrative across the Atlantic.
The pre-Columbian contact.
Yes. Van Sertima argues that the global reach of these African empires extended all the way to the Americas, long before 1492. How does he build that case?
Van Sertima's thesis is highly detailed and relies on converging lines of evidence. First, he looks at the ocean currents.
Okay, the geography of the ocean.
He points out that the Canary Current off the coast of West Africa acts like a natural high-speed conveyor belt directly to the Caribbean and South America.
It just sweeps you right over?
He argues that ancient African mariners, who we already established were building deep-water vessels, would have inevitably navigated these currents.
What physical evidence does he point to?
He points to the massive Olmec stone heads found in Mexico, which predate Columbus by millennia, highlighting their distinctly African facial features.
Right, the statues.
He also leans heavily on botanical evidence, noting the pre-Columbian presence of certain strains of cotton, bottle gourds, and yams in the Americas that originated in Africa, suggesting transoceanic trade or migration.
Because plants don't just swim across the ocean.
Exactly. Furthermore, he highlights the historical accounts of the Mali Empire, specifically Emperor Abubakar II, who in the early 14th century is recorded to have equipped a fleet of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of ships to explore the limits of the Western Ocean, never to return.
Wow.
Van Sertima argues that these fleets reached the Americas.
So we have this profound picture being painted by the sources. You have populations that developed early chemistry, built the libraries of Egypt, formulated a continent-wide constitutional ethos, re-civilized Europe with universities and agriculture, and potentially navigated the Atlantic centuries before Columbus.
Which raises an incredibly urgent, almost agonizing question. And it's an irony that every single author in this stack points out repeatedly.
Right. How do the very people who brought literacy, hygiene, advanced mathematics, and arguably the seeds of the Renaissance to a struggling Europe later became characterized by European historians as a people completely lacking in intellectual capacity or historical significance?
How does that flip happen?
How do you go from being the architects of civilization to being classified as intellectually inferior savages?
It is the ultimate historical contradiction. If these magnificent world-altering achievements are factual, as our sources argue with extensive data, how on earth did they become completely obscured from modern memory?
And that, Kwojan, brings us to the darkest, most complex, and arguably the most important part of our deep dive. We are shifting to the architecture of erasure.
The cover-up.
What Dr. Yosef Benjo-Cannon famously calls cultural genocide, and what John Henrik Clarke expands upon in his critique of global history.
The transition from glorious antiquity to modern obscurity wasn't an accident of time.
It wasn't just forgetting.
The authors argue vehemently that this was the result of a systematic, deliberate, and highly organized rewriting of human history. It wasn't just about forgetting. It was about actively destroying the memory.
Let's unpack the specific mechanisms of this cultural genocide. According to the texts, how exactly do you erase the history of an entire continent?
They started with taxonomy.
The authors point first to the whitewashing of antiquity, specifically through taxonomy. Can you explain that?
Taxonomy, the science of classification, was weaponized. The texts explain how, particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries, European Egyptologists and historians, as well as Arab and Asian conquerors earlier on, actively reclassified Black Egyptians and other pivotal historical figures.
Reclassified them how?
They created new racial categories out of thin air, labeling these ancient builders as Caucasian, Semitic, or Hamitic.
Why create those specific labels? What was the goal?
The authors argue this was a deliberate, calculated strategy to sever these ancient geniuses from their Black African roots.
To detach them from the rest of the continent.
Exactly. During the rise of the transatlantic slave trade and European colonialism, the colonizers needed a moral and intellectual justification for their actions.
Right, cognitive dissonance.
You cannot justify enslaving a population if you simultaneously acknowledge them as the creators of science and civilization.
That breaks the whole justification.
So, if you can change the racial classification of the builders, if you can say the Egyptians were actually European or Near Eastern, you can effectively claim their buildings, their science, and their legacy as your own, while leaving the rest of the African continent with a fabricated narrative of perpetual savagery.
The sources go into chilling detail about how this erasure moved from the history books into physical vandalism.
The defacement of the statues.
They detail the tactic of literally defacing monuments, the most famous example being the knocking off of the noses from statues like the Great Sphinx or the deliberate destruction of the faces of certain pharaohs.
It wasn't an accident.
The authors on this wasn't just random weathering or target practice. They argue it was a deliberate attempt to hide the Negroid features, the thick lips and broad noses that clearly identify the racial origins of those deities and rulers.
It is a literal, physical defacement of history. But the texts argue that the erasure went far deeper than chipping stone.
Where else did it go?
It infiltrated the deepest realms of human psychology and the divine. The sources discuss at length how religion was weaponized to cement this newly fabricated hierarchy.
A biblical justification.
They point heavily to the biblical story of Noah and the curse of Ham.
Let's explain that, because the curse of Ham is referenced so frequently in these texts as a tool of oppression. What is the actual story and how is it twisted?
In the Genesis narrative, Noah curses his grandson Canaan, the son of Ham, to be a servant of servants to his brothers.
Okay, so a family curse.
Now, the authors point out that nowhere in the original text does it mention race or skin color.
Not a single mention.
However, from the Middle Ages onwards, and accelerating dramatically during the transatlantic slave trade, European and Arab theologians and institutions deliberately twisted this mythological narrative.
How did they twist it?
They popularized the interpretation that Ham represented the Black populations of Africa, and therefore Black people were divinely, permanently cursed by God to be the servants and slaves of white populations.
So they use a religious text to provide divine sanction for a brutal economic system.
Exactly. God said it was okay.
And the texts point out the hypocrisy here. While they were actively promoting the curse of Ham, these same historical narratives were deliberately ignoring the profound African and Egyptian origins of major religious figures.
Yes. The sources point out that Moses, a central figure in the Abrahamic faiths, had an African wife, Zipporah, who was often marginalized in the teachings.
Swept under the rug.
They point to Pharaoh Akhenaten as arguably the first pioneer of monotheism, introducing the concept of a single supreme creator long before it took root in the Levant.
You never hear about that.
Because these deep African roots of global religion are aggressively scrubbed out, while the curse of Ham narrative was amplified across the globe.
And this brings us to John Henrik Clarke's monumental argument regarding Christopher Columbus, which really ties this global system of erasure together.
Clarke's thesis is brilliant.
Clarke posits that the year 1492 didn't just initiate an African holocaust of physical enslavement and the destruction of indigenous peoples in the Americas. His core thesis is that Columbus and the European expansion he represents institutionalized a global system that colonized information.
Colonizing information. It is perhaps the most profound concept in Clarke's work.
It's a heavy phrase.
What he means is that the conquerors didn't just steal the land, the gold, and the physical labor. They stole the narrative apparatus of the planet.
They took control of the story.
They established a global academic, cartographic, and historical framework where only the European perspective was considered valid, objective truth.
How does one colonize information in a practical sense? Like day to day?
By controlling the choke points of knowledge. They controlled the printing presses, determining what books were mass-produced.
Right.
They controlled the universities, determining what constituted legitimate scholarship. They redrew the maps of the world, often placing Europe artificially at the center and top, while shrinking the relative size of Africa.
The Mercator projection.
Yes. They designed the curriculums that would be taught globally for centuries.
So if we look at the expert analysis from these texts, what is the psychological fallout of this information colonization? Because this isn't just about losing territory. As the sources term it, this is the architecture of mental slavery.
The psychological impact is devastating and multi-generational. By stealing a people's history and claiming the achievements of the conquered as their own, the colonizers leave the subjugated population with a fabricated, empty history.
A blank slate.
A narrative that suggests they have never been anything but subjects, slaves, or primitives. If you strip a people of their past greatness, you make them believe their historical baseline is subjugation.
That's insidious.
It is an incredibly effective, insidious way to maintain dominance because the subjugated people no longer have a historical precedent or a cultural memory of their own sovereignty, genius, or capacity to rule.
You can feel the visceral frustration of this playing out in the modern day within these texts. Dr. Ben Notanen highlights the specific agony of modern Black educators.
The teachers in the classrooms today.
He talks about teachers who are handed state-mandated African-American history lesson plans that begin abruptly on a slave ship in the 1600s, completely omitting the preceding 200,000 years of glorious foundational history.
Starting the story at the lowest point.
By being forced to teach these limited, sanitized, trauma-based curriculums, these educators are essentially being drafted to participate in the ongoing cultural genocide of their own people, passing the erasure down to the next generation of children.
It is a tragic, self-perpetuating cycle. The colonization of information ensures that the erasure maintains itself.
But the authors don't just stop there.
No, the authors we are examining today do not stop at diagnosing the cultural and psychological damage. They make a crucial pivot.
See the economics.
They argue that this physical and cultural genocide wasn't just about ego or racism. It laid the very real, very tangible, and mathematically quantifiable foundation for global economic inequality today.
Which perfectly bridges us to the next massive theme in this stack of books. We are merging the historical and anthropological findings of Chancellor Williams with the hardcore economic thesis of Claude Anderson's Black Labor, White Wealth.
To understand the economics, we first have to understand the physical displacement.
Okay, take us through it.
Williams asks a fundamental, almost painful question in The Destruction of Black Civilization. What specific mechanisms caused these great builders, the people who built Thebes, who wrote 700,000 books, who developed a continent-wide constitution, to fall to the absolute bottom of the global socioeconomic ladder?
And his answer isn't a single event. It's a relentless, agonizing millennium of attrition.
It was wave after wave.
He points to centuries of continuous invasions from the north and east, the Hyksos, the Assyrians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, and later the Arab conquests.
They were constantly under siege.
Coupled with this, he details the devastating environmental impact of the advancing drying deserts, specifically the expansion of the Sahara, which destroyed agricultural bases and forced massive populations inward and southward.
The land itself was turning against them.
Williams paints a picture of a once unified people who were essentially chased across their own continent, suffering endless internal strife over shrinking resources.
The fragmentation is the ultimate tragedy of Williams' thesis. The unified civilization, the one that shared that massive constitutional system, was literally shattered under the combined weight of foreign invasion and environmental collapse.
They had to scatter to survive.
As they migrated and isolated themselves for survival, they fractured. They eventually splintered into countless small tribes, ultimately speaking over 2,000 different languages.
That destroys any chance of large-scale coordination.
Unity was replaced by strict local survivalism, deep isolation, and inevitably profound vulnerability.
And that profound vulnerability was perfectly tragically timed for the rise of European maritime power and the transatlantic slave trade.
The perfect storm.
This is exactly where Claude Anderson's economic thesis takes over. Anderson argues that European powers seized the unprecedented opportunity of the newly discovered Americas to structure an entirely new government and capitalist system strictly and exclusively to their own advantage.
Built from the ground up for them.
And the primary capitalistic element, the raw fuel in this new economic machine, Black people.
Anderson's analysis is stark, unsentimental, and strictly economic. He insists that we view chattel slavery not primarily as a moral or religious feeling, but as a highly calculated, ruthlessly efficient economic engine.
It was a business model.
Black bodies were not just free labor. They were the capital. They were the collateral used to secure loans to build early American infrastructure.
Human beings as collateral for bank loans.
Yes, they were the foundational assets upon which the modern insurance industry was built. The wealth generated by their free labor, the cotton, the sugar, the tobacco, the infrastructure was captured entirely by the white power structure.
Anderson outlines how this system was designed to build massive, compounding generational wealth for white societies while actively legally prohibiting the accumulation of any wealth for Black people.
You literally couldn't own anything.
It was a zero-sum economic game enforced by law.
Precisely. And this leads to what is arguably Anderson's most controversial and provocative point regarding the modern era.
Right, about the 1960s.
When he analyzes the mid-20th century civil rights movement, he argues that the concept of integration actually hurt the Black community economically.
Wait, let me make sure I'm following Anderson's math here. He's arguing that integration, the defining goal of the 1960s, hurt the community economically.
Yes.
That runs counter to almost everything taught in standard history curriculums. How exactly does he justify that claim using economic data?
It is a jarring thesis, but his logic is deeply rooted in capital flow. Anderson argues that prior to integration, the brutal reality of segregation forced Black communities to practice closed-group economics.
Because they had no other choice.
Because they could not participate in the wider white economy. They had to build their own parallel structures. They had their own doctors, their own grocery stores, their own banks, their own bus companies, their own entertainment districts.
The Black Wall Streets.
Often referred to as Black Wall Streets, yes. When a dollar entered that community, it circulated multiple times before leaving.
It was a captive economy, but it was a functioning, self-sustaining one.
Exactly. But with integration, Anderson argues, the legal barriers fell, and the Black community immediately took their spending power out of their own neighborhoods and gave it to larger white-owned businesses.
They spent their money elsewhere.
Integration diluted their numerical and economic strength. It destroyed those independent Black economic structures, closed down the Black-owned grocery stores and banks, and made the Black community almost entirely dependent as consumers in an economy where they owned very little of the means of production.
The sources draw a very hard, uncomfortable line here, and we really need to break down the difference they see between civil rights and economic power.
They are not the same thing.
The ability to legally sit at a lunch counter without being arrested is a civil right. It is a moral victory. But, as Anderson points out, it didn't equate to owning the lunch counter.
That is the crux of his argument. You won the right to spend your money at the counter, but the profits generated from that counter still immediately left the community, compounding wealth elsewhere.
The money drains out.
If we look at the historical through line, the physical and linguistic fragmentation of Africa that Chancellor Williams documented, the splintering of a unified people into 2,000 isolated languages, directly mirrors the modern fragmentation of Black economic power that Claude Anderson's describing.
Wow, it's the exact same pattern of division.
A lack of unified, collective, strategic action.
I want you, the listener, to consider the sheer scale of this for a moment. Think about the global economy today. Wall Street, the massive banking institutions of Europe, the towering infrastructure of the Americas.
The wealth is staggering.
Now, based on Anderson's thesis, speculate how entirely different the global landscape would look today if the immense wealth generated by centuries of free Black labor had been retained, invested, and compounded within the Black community rather than being violently extracted.
The geopolitical and economic landscape of the planet would be completely unrecognizable. The massive imbalances we see today, the wealth gaps, the infrastructural deficits, are not accidental or natural.
It's math.
According to the data presented in these sources, they are the direct mathematical result of centuries of extracted labor, compounded by the intentional destruction of Black independent economic structures.
So with all of this laid bare, the 200,000 years of profound history, the systematic cultural erasure, the brutal economic extraction, and the fragmentation of power, what do these sources say is the path forward?
It's not just a tragedy.
Are we just left with a massive, tragic post-mortem of a civilization?
Not at all. And that brings us to the final phase of our deep dive, reclaiming the narrative and the future. The authors we are studying today, Williams, Anderson, Clark, Buchanan, are not just historians cataloging loss. They are strategists providing a blueprint for reconstruction.
Yes. This is where the narrative shifts from diagnosis to an actionable, empowering blueprint. The sources lean heavily on the wisdom of Carter G. Woodson, who famously wrote a quote that serves as the philosophical engine for this entire deep dive.
It's a powerful quote.
If a race has no history, if it has no worthwhile tradition, it becomes a negligible factor in the thought of the world, and it stands in danger of being exterminated.
That quote perfectly encapsulates why this history matters today. History, as these authors argue, is not just trivia. It is a compass and a clock.
A compass and a clock.
It tells you where you are geographically and politically, and what time it is in your cultural development. The goal of reclaiming the knowledge of ancient Egypt, or the Moors, or the 60,000-year-old chemistry labs isn't just to boast about past glories. It is deeply pragmatic.
Right. You study the past to diagnose the present. You study the fatal splintering that Chancellor Williams described during the Great Migrations so that you don't repeat that same splintering and infighting in your communities today.
You learn from the vulnerabilities.
You learn exactly how your information was colonized by figures like Columbus and early historians, so you can actively decolonize your own mind and the curriculums you teach your children.
And on the economic front, Claude Anderson offers a highly specific, actionable solution.
What's the plan?
He argues that Black Americans must stop trying to emulate the paths of subsequent ethnic immigrants who arrived in America under entirely different historical, legal, and economic circumstances.
The bootstraps narrative doesn't apply.
The strategies that worked for voluntary immigrants will not work for a population recovering from centuries of targeted economic extraction. Instead, he advocates for a return to group economics, specifically through the building of what he calls vertical businesses.
Let's really break down the concept of vertical businesses because this is a fascinating and highly practical economic model. Anderson says Black communities should leverage their dominance in areas where they already possess massive cultural capital and consumer power.
Industries like sports, fashion, and music.
But instead of just being the talent, the athletes, and the singers generating wealth for others, they need total industry control. Vertical integration.
Exactly. Let's trace how that works in the music industry, for example. In a non-integrated model, the artist writes the song, but a corporate label owns the master recording.
A different company distributes it.
Another owns the streaming platform, another owns the concert venue, and yet another handles the ticketing and merchandising.
So everyone takes a cut.
The artist captures only a tiny fraction of the value they created.
But in Anderson's vertical business model, the community practices group economics. You don't just write the song. A Black-owned entity owns the publishing rights. Another Black-owned tech company builds the distribution platform.
A Black-owned real estate group owns the concert venue.
A Black-owned security firm guards the venue. And a Black-owned catering company serves the food. Every single dollar generated by that cultural product touches 5, 6, or 7 different Black-owned businesses before it ever leaves the ecosystem.
That is the modern application of group economics. It is taking the fragmented, heavily diluted economic power of the community and unifying it into a fortified structure.
It's brilliant.
It is the modern economic equivalent of the ancient, continent-wide constitutional systems that Williams described, where the resources of the community are managed for the collective survival and elevation of the community.
Bring it full circle.
The authors argue that critical thinking, unsanitized historical self-knowledge, and dedicated group economics are the ultimate weapons against the ongoing colonization of information and wealth.
It's an incredibly powerful, actionable blueprint. Just like the ancients who unified to build the pyramids and the libraries of Thebes, modern empowerment, according to these deeply researched sources, requires a unified national public policy for Black Americans.
It's a psychological shift, really.
It is. Seeing oneself not merely as a descendant of slaves whose history began in chains, but as a direct descendant of the world's first innovators, architects, and scientists.
The through line connecting all these books is brilliantly clear. You cannot chart a successful, sovereign course for the future if you do not possess an accurate, uncolonized map of your past.
So let's pull all of these massive threads together. We have gone on an incredible paradigm-shifting journey today.
We really covered a lot of ground.
We started by exploring the 60,000-year-old chemistry labs and 30,000-year-old ecological tracking systems of early Africa. We walked through the staggering libraries of Egypt holding 700,000 books of advanced philosophy and science.
The continent-wide constitutional democracies uncovered by Chancellor Williams.
We rode with General Tariq and the Moors as they brought literacy, hygiene, and the seeds of the Renaissance to a Dark Age Europe. We sailed the Atlantic currents with Emperor Abu Bakr II before Columbus,
Uncovering the chilling erasure.
the systematic, deliberate erasure of this entire history by conquerors who knocked the noses off statues, invented fake racial taxonomies, and colonized the global flow of information. And finally, we looked at the brutal economic extraction of slavery and the modern economic strategies, vertical integration and group economics required to reclaim that lost legacy.
The core unifying message of the formidable stack of sources we examine today is that history is absolutely not a static, dusty thing of the past.
It's alive.
It is an active, living mechanism. It is the vital key to unlocking and commanding the future.
I want to leave you with a final, lingering thought to mull over as you go about your day. When you look at the great, prestigious museums of the world today, museums in London, Paris, New York, filled with millions of artifacts gathered and often looted during centuries of global colonialism.
The archives of the world.
Consider everything we've discussed about the deliberate colonization of information. What if the most earth-shattering discoveries about human history aren't waiting to be dug out of the ground in some distant, sandy excavation site?
That's the profound thought.
What if the greatest secrets of who we are, what we achieved, and where we came from are actually sitting right now in the dusty, climate-controlled basements of those very museums, deliberately mislabeled, misclassified, and hidden away, just waiting for someone brave enough and educated enough to read them correctly?
When you understand the architecture of erasure, it really makes you wonder what else has been hiding in plain sight all along.
It really does change everything. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.